Disrespect rarely announces itself loudly. It does not crash into your life with shouting or open hostility. It arrives quietly, disguised as humor, wrapped in casual tones, hidden inside interruptions, subtle dismissals, and moments where your presence is treated as optional. And this is exactly why it is dangerous, because the mind is conditioned to respond only to obvious threats, while subtle disrespect slips past unnoticed and slowly reshapes how others treat you. And the silent samurai understood that disrespect is not an attack, it is a probe, a test sent out unconsciously by others to see what they can get away with, to measure how much emotional access they have, how stable your center is, and whether your boundaries are real or performative. Because humans are constantly reading one another for cues, not through words, but through reactions. And the moment you react emotionally, positively or negatively, you give information away. You show where your buttons are. And when someone sees that a small joke makes you defensive, or a dismissive tone makes you angry, or being ignored makes you over-explain, they learn something dangerous about you. They learn how to control the interaction, because emotional reactions invite escalation. They signal that disrespect is working, that it has produced a response. And most people don't realize that every time they explain themselves, snap back, or swallow their discomfort, they are participating in a dominance exchange they never agreed to enter. And this is why disrespect repeats itself, not because people are evil, but because behavior that produces results gets repeated. And the modern world is filled with subtle disrespect precisely because it is rarely punished correctly. Instead, it is rewarded with emotion. And the silent samurai saw this clearly. He observed before acting. He studied patterns instead of personalities, and he realized that disrespect survives only where access is allowed. Access to your time, your attention, your emotional energy, your presence. And once that access is removed, disrespect has nothing to feed on. But before most people ever reach that understanding, they fall into one of two weak responses that train future disrespect. The first is aggression, the instinct to confront, to correct, to put someone in their place, to raise the voice, sharpen the tone, and reassert dominance through force. But aggression is not strength, it is loss of control disguised as confidence. Because the moment you explode, you hand the other person power over your emotional state. You show that they can move you, that they can pull you out of your center. And even if you win the argument, you lose authority, because authority is calm, not reactive. And aggressive responses tell the world that your peace is fragile, easily disturbed, and worth testing again. And the second weak response is submission, staying silent while internally shrinking, laughing along when something crosses a line, tolerating behavior that erodes self-respect, telling yourself it's not worth it, while teaching others that your boundaries are flexible, optional, and safe to ignore. And submission may look peaceful on the surface, but it is a quiet form of self-betrayal, because every time you accept disrespect without consequence, you reinforce it. You train people how to treat you. And this is why both aggression and submission lead to the same outcome, repeated disrespect, because one invites challenge and the other invites exploitation. And the silent samurai rejected both, choosing a third path that most people never consider: calm withdrawal. Not withdrawal from strength, but withdrawal of access. Because when someone disrespects you, what they are really doing is testing whether they are still allowed into your space on the same terms. And the modern forms of disrespect are everywhere if you know how to see them. Dismissive humor that hides behind just joking, where something cutting is said and then softened just enough to give plausible deniability. Interruptions and talking over you that quietly assert conversational control. Inconsistent treatment where respect fluctuates based on mood or convenience, revealing a lack of reliability and regard. Minimized boundaries where requests are ignored or mocked with phrases like "you're too serious," and passive-aggressive behavior that baits emotional reactions while pretending innocence.
And all of these forms share one thing in common. They seek emotional engagement. They want you to react, explain, correct, defend, or prove something, because reaction equals relevance, and relevance equals leverage. And this is why the samurai philosophy matters here, because warriors were taught that still water defeats turbulence, that emotional stability exhausts chaos, that silence can apply more pressure than words ever could. And a warrior did not rush to strike at every provocation. He observed, measured, and allowed the opponent to reveal themselves through their impatience. And this philosophy translates perfectly to modern social dynamics, because silence, when paired with composure, is not weakness, it is psychological pressure. It forces the other person to sit with their behavior without the distraction of your reaction. And most people cannot tolerate that mirror, because when you do not react, do not explain, and do not escalate, you deny them the reward they were unconsciously seeking. And this is where the silent samurai rule begins to emerge, not as a tactic, but as a way of being, an understanding that disrespect is sustained by access, and that access is always optional. And once you grasp that truth, you stop seeing disrespect as something to fight or endure, and start seeing it as information. Information that tells you exactly how much distance is required. And this shift alone changes everything. Because when you stop reacting emotionally, you stop being predictable. And when you stop being predictable, dominance games collapse, because there is nothing left to push against.
The silent samurai rule is simple but devastatingly effective. Disrespect survives on access. Remove access, not your composure. And this rule works because it requires no confrontation, no explanation, and no emotional escalation, which is exactly what most people expect from you. And when expectations are violated calmly, power shifts immediately. Because the moment someone disrespects you, they are watching closely to see what happens next. They are reading your response as data. And when the response does not arrive in the form they anticipated, confusion sets in. And confusion disrupts dominance games, which is why the silent samurai response is not reactive, but procedural, built on 4 deliberate steps that train behavior without words. The first step is pause. Not a dramatic pause, not an awkward silence, but a controlled moment where you do nothing. You allow a comment to land without flinching. You maintain calm eye contact or neutral posture, and you refuse to rush into explanation or defense, because speed is emotional and slowness is authority. And this pause alone often destabilizes the interaction because it removes momentum, and momentum is what disrespect feeds on. The second step is minimal acknowledgement, which may be a short, neutral response or silence itself, but never justification, never humor back, never emotional coloring, because overcommunication is a form of submission, and humor used defensively is still a reaction. And when you respond minimally, you signal that the comment did not earn your energy, that it was insufficient to provoke engagement, and this subtly repositions you above the exchange rather than inside it. The third step is withdrawal of access, which is the core of the system, because access is currency, and when respect is absent, currency is withdrawn. This does not mean dramatic exits or cold hostility. It means less engagement, shorter interactions, reduced availability, emotional distance, and fewer opportunities for the person to access your time or presence. And this is where most people fail, because they want immediate correction, immediate validation, immediate justice. But the samurai understands that behavior changes through consequences, not conversations. And when access decreases, the environment changes. The other person feels the shift, often without being able to articulate why. And this discomfort forces reflection. And the fourth step is observation. Not revenge, not resentment, but observation. Watching whether respect returns, whether behavior adjusts, whether tone improves. And if it does, access can be restored gradually, calmly, without mention of the past, because the lesson has already been learned.
But if disrespect continues, distance increases, not out of anger, but out of alignment. And this is how boundaries become real, because they are enforced consistently, without emotional theatrics. And this system works because psychologically it removes reward. Dominance games require feedback, they require emotional movement, and when none arrives, the game collapses. It forces self-correction because the other person must now reconcile the loss of access with their own behavior. And most importantly, it preserves your authority, because authority is not loud, it is stable. And this aligns perfectly with Stoic philosophy, which teaches that the best revenge is not to be like them, that the inner citadel must remain intact regardless of external provocation, and that control over the response is the only real control you ever have. And this is why the silent samurai does not fight every insult, because he does not need to prove his strength to those who test him. And he does not tolerate disrespect either, because tolerance trains repetition. And he understands that the space between aggression and submission is where true authority lives, a space of calm withdrawal where access becomes conditional on respect. And this is what separates the emotionally disciplined from the emotionally reactive. Because when you master this rule, people either rise to meet your standard or remove themselves from your life. And both outcomes protect your peace, because respect does not come from words, it comes from consequences delivered without emotion. And once people realize they cannot provoke you, cannot extract reactions, cannot control you through subtle disrespect, that behavior quietly disappears, not because you demanded it to stop, but because there was no longer anything to gain from continuing it. And this is the silent samurai way. Not loud, not dramatic, not performative, but unshakable. Because silence, when backed by self-respect and consistent action, is not empty, it is final.
A silent samurai does not treat the rule for handling disrespect as a trick to be used occasionally. He treats it as a way of moving through the world, because calm dominance is not something you switch on in moments of conflict. It is something you embody long before conflict ever appears. And this is why people who truly command respect rarely need to demand it. Their presence already communicates boundaries, stability, and consequence. And when you live this way, you begin to notice something subtle but powerful. Most disrespect never even reaches you because it senses there is nothing to push against, nothing to extract, nothing to gain. And this is the highest level of mastery, where your energy alone filters your environment because people instinctively test where they feel they might win and avoid where they sense quiet strength. And this is why calm dominance changes not just how others treat you, but how you see yourself. Because when you stop reacting emotionally, you reclaim authorship over your inner world. You no longer feel the urge to correct, defend, or prove. And that urge was never about justice, it was about insecurity seeking relief. And once that insecurity dissolves, so does the need to engage. And this is where the silent samurai separates himself completely from the crowd. Because most people are addicted to engagement. They crave acknowledgement, even when it comes in the form of disrespect. They would rather be provoked than ignored, because provocation still feels like relevance. But the samurai understands that relevance without respect is a trap, and he refuses to participate, which is why withdrawal of access is so powerful. Not because it punishes the other person, but because it protects your internal order. And internal order always projects outward, shaping how others respond to you. And this is why silence teaches faster than words, because words invite debate, and debate invites ego. But silence, paired with consistent distance, leaves only one variable to adjust: behavior. And when behavior adjusts, respect returns naturally, without apology, without confrontation, without drama. And if it does not adjust, the distance remains, not as a threat, but as a consequence. And consequences are what the nervous system understands at the deepest level, far more than lectures or emotional displays ever could. And this is where many people make a fatal mistake. They think withdrawal of access is cold or cruel,
when in reality it is clean. It removes resentment, it removes rumination, it removes the endless replaying of conversations in your head, because you are no longer trying to win internally what you already lost externally. Instead, you are aligned, your actions match your standards, and that alignment creates peace. And peace is magnetic. It attracts those who are capable of respect and repels those who are not. And this is not loneliness, it is refinement. Because a silent samurai would rather walk alone than be surrounded by people who require him to shrink, explain, or endure subtle disrespect. And as you live this way longer, something else begins to happen. Your presence slows rooms down. People listen more closely. Interruptions decrease. Dismissive humor fades because your reactions are no longer available as entertainment or leverage. And even when disrespect does occur, it feels different. It feels distant, almost irrelevant, because you are no longer emotionally inside the exchange. You are observing it from above, calmly deciding how much access remains appropriate. And this is ultimate authority, not control over others, but sovereignty over yourself. Which is why the Stoics taught that no one can insult you without your permission, and permission is given through reaction, through explanation, through emotional engagement. And once you withdraw that permission consistently, life becomes quieter, cleaner, and more focused, because your energy is no longer leaking into unnecessary battles. And the silent samurai understands that not every disrespectful person is an enemy. Some are simply unaware, untrained, or insecure, and the system allows them to self-correct without humiliation, which preserves dignity on both sides. But it also makes one thing very clear. Access is conditional, and conditions are not negotiated verbally. They are enforced through behavior. And when you live this rule daily, you no longer fear being disrespected because you trust your response. You know that you will not lose yourself to anger, and you will not abandon yourself through silence that betrays your standards. Instead, you will withdraw calmly, decisively, and without explanation. And this confidence radiates because people sense when someone is unmovable, not stubborn, but centered, not aggressive, but grounded, not submissive, but selective. And this selectiveness is what makes respect inevitable, because humans rise to clear standards or remove themselves from them, and both outcomes serve the silent samurai, because his peace remains intact, his inner citadel unbreached, and his life uncluttered by those who mistake access for entitlement. And once you internalize this, you realize that silence is not empty, it is full of meaning. It communicates boundaries louder than words ever could. And calm dominance is not about winning interactions, it is about outgrowing them. Because when you no longer need to react, explain, or prove, you have already won.
Ultimately, what Arthur Schopenhauer teaches is not merely a philosophy of solitude, but a warning about the cost of avoiding it. Because a life spent constantly surrounded by noise, opinion, and distraction may feel full, but often lacks depth, direction, and authenticity. And in a world that rewards visibility, approval, and constant interaction, choosing solitude becomes a radical act of self-respect, because it signals that you value truth over applause and clarity over comfort. And the tragedy Schopenhauer identified is that most people never experience their own mind at full strength because they are conditioned from an early age to seek meaning outside themselves, tying their worth to achievement, recognition, and comparison. And when those external sources fluctuate, as they inevitably do, their sense of self collapses with them, leading to anxiety, resentment, and a quiet dissatisfaction they cannot explain. And solitude breaks this cycle by shifting the center of gravity inward, teaching you that fulfillment comes not from being seen, but from seeing clearly. And this clarity is what allows you to move through life with intention rather than reaction. And Schopenhauer understood that the fear of solitude is ultimately the fear of self-discovery, because solitude reveals whether you are living your own life or merely fulfilling a role assigned by others. And this realization can be unsettling, but it is also the beginning of freedom, Because once you understand your own values, capabilities, and limits, you stop chasing illusions and start building something real, something enduring. And this is why Schopenhauer believed that the ability to enjoy solitude was a sign of maturity, because only someone comfortable with themselves can remain alone without escaping into distraction. And this does not mean rejecting connection, but transforming it, because relationships formed from wholeness rather than dependency are healthier, more honest, and more meaningful. And this principle applies not only to personal relationships, but to work, creativity, and purpose itself, because true contribution does not come from copying what already exists, but from expressing something that only you can offer. And this expression requires solitude as its incubation space, because originality cannot survive constant interference. And this is the final paradox that Schopenhauer understood deeply, which is that solitude appears empty from the outside, but rich from within, while constant social immersion appears full, but often leaves the inner world impoverished. And the modern world will continue to pull you toward noise, urgency, and performance because that is where attention is harvested and conformity is maintained. But your greatest strength does not exist there. It exists in the quiet moments you postpone, the unanswered questions you avoid, and the uncomfortable silence you try to fill. And the choice is not between isolation and connection, but between authenticity and imitation, between depth and distraction, and between living deliberately or drifting passively. And solitude is not the enemy of success, but the foundation of it. Because every meaningful decision requires clarity, every original idea requires space, and every fulfilled life requires self-understanding. And Schopenhauer's legacy reminds us that you cannot outsource those things to society, technology, or approval. They must be cultivated internally through honest engagement with your own mind and the courage to stand alone long enough to hear what it is trying to tell you. Because within that silence lies not emptiness, but direction, not loneliness, but self-possession, and not weakness, but strength. And in a world full of copies, trends, and borrowed identities, solitude remains the one place where the original version of you can still be found, waiting patiently, quietly, for you to stop running and finally listen.
When everything is stripped away, when noise fades, when expectations dissolve, when no one is watching and nothing is required of you, what remains is the truth of who you are. And Arthur Schopenhauer understood that most people never reach this point because they are terrified of what silence might reveal. Yet silence is not empty, it is revealing, because solitude does not add anything to you, but removes what is false, peeling away borrowed beliefs, inherited ambitions, social conditioning, and unconscious imitation until only the essential self remains. And this process feels uncomfortable because it forces accountability. Because when distractions disappear, you can no longer blame the world, society, or circumstances for your dissatisfaction. And Schopenhauer believed that this discomfort is necessary because it signals growth, much like physical pain signals the strengthening of muscle. And without this confrontation, people remain mentally dependent, forever shaped by trends, opinions, and the emotional weather of the crowd. And this dependency weakens the soul because it hands over authority of one's inner life to forces that neither understand nor care about individual truth. And the modern world amplifies this danger by rewarding constant visibility, reaction, and comparison, pushing people into endless loops of performance where silence feels like failure and stillness feels like death. Yet history tells a very different story, because every enduring contribution to human thought, art, science, and philosophy emerged from periods of deep solitude, where individuals turned inward long enough to understand something the crowd could not see. And Schopenhauer lived this truth fully, accepting misunderstanding, rejection, and neglect rather than compromising his ideas, because he knew that truth ripens slowly while popularity rots quickly. And this is why his work survived while countless celebrated voices of his time faded into obscurity. Because solitude does not make you trendy, it makes you precise, and precision lasts.
And this is the lesson modern people resist most because it requires patience rather than speed, clarity rather than excitement, and inner depth rather than external appearance. Yet without these qualities, life becomes shallow regardless of success, because achievement without authenticity feels hollow, and connection without self-knowledge feels crowded but lonely. And Schopenhauer warned that when people avoid solitude long enough, they lose contact with their inner compass, drifting through life guided by convenience rather than conviction, mistaking motion for progress and approval for meaning. And the tragedy is not that such lives are unsuccessful, but that they are unlived. Because the person never truly arrives, never fully inhabits their own thoughts, desires, and potential. And solitude is the doorway back to oneself, not as an escape, but as a return. Because only when you can sit alone without stimulation do you begin to hear your own mind clearly. And that clarity is what gives rise to resilience, creativity, and inner authority, qualities that cannot be faked or outsourced. And once cultivated, they change how you move through the world, because criticism loses its power, comparison fades, and fear of being different dissolves, replaced by quiet confidence grounded in self-understanding. And this is why solitude ultimately strengthens rather than weakens relationships, because when you no longer need others to complete you, you can meet them honestly rather than strategically. And Schopenhauer believed that the ability to enjoy one's own company was the highest sign of mental richness, because it meant that the individual possessed an inner life deep enough to sustain itself. And this depth cannot be purchased, taught quickly, or gained through association. It must be earned slowly through contemplation, introspection, and the courage to face oneself without illusion. And the world will always try to pull you away from this path because distraction is profitable and conformity is convenient. But the question remains whether you want a life shaped by noise or one shaped by intention, whether you want to be endlessly occupied or deeply fulfilled, whether you want to be remembered as someone who blended in perfectly or someone who stood alone long enough to see clearly. Because solitude does not promise comfort, applause, or immediate reward, but it offers something far more valuable, which is ownership of your own mind. And that ownership is the foundation of freedom, creativity, and meaning. And Schopenhauer's legacy is not an argument against society, but an argument for self-possession, reminding us that before you can truly contribute to the world, you must first understand yourself. And that understanding begins not in crowds, not in noise, not in endless consumption, but in stillness, in silence, and in the courage to be alone. Because only there does the original version of you emerge, unfiltered, unedited, and finally free.
In the end, Arthur Schopenhauer's message is not merely about solitude, but about truth, because solitude is the environment where truth can exist without distortion, where you are no longer shaped by applause, fear, or imitation, and where your mind finally belongs to you rather than to the expectations of the crowd. And this is why solitude feels uncomfortable at first, because it removes the familiar noise that once told you who to be and what to want, forcing you to confront your own thoughts without escape. Yet within that silence lies the rarest form of freedom, the freedom of self-possession. Because when you are no longer dependent on validation, comparison, or approval, you gain clarity, resilience, and originality. And that clarity allows you to act with intention rather than reaction, to create rather than copy, and to live rather than perform. And Schopenhauer proved through his life that greatness does not come from fitting in or being constantly seen, but from standing alone long enough to understand something deeply, trusting it fully, and expressing it honestly, even when the world is slow to listen. Because truth does not need immediate recognition to be real, and authenticity does not require permission to exist. And in a world addicted to distraction, choosing solitude is a radical act of courage, patience, and self-respect, because it means you value depth over noise and meaning over momentum. And the real question you are left with is not whether solitude is difficult, but whether avoiding it has already cost you clarity, direction, and a relationship with your own mind. Because your greatest ideas, your strongest convictions, and your truest self do not live in the crowd. They live in the quiet moments you keep postponing, waiting for you to stop running, stop performing, and finally listen. Because only in solitude does the original you emerge, and only the original is ever capable of greatness.